are officially starting here. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. As we wait for people to join, I just wanted to thank you for your participation. Thank you for some of you who've actually sent questions in advance. So we will be managing the chat and getting to your questions as we go through our session for today. So welcome. This, just to make sure you are in the right space, this is a webinar today on money matters when it comes to divorce, but this is something designed specifically for professional advisors. So attorneys, accountants, mediators, financial advisors, those are the people who are in our audience for today. So we're going to assume that everyone here knows the basics about divorce, and we're just going to share some additional unusual things that we found in the last year, including a whole new world when it comes to mortgages. It is not the way it used to be, and Louise is going to talk about that today. So in terms of introductions, we'll just quickly let you know who we are. I'm Amy Jamrog. I have been a financial advisor for 28 years, which is wild to me, but we have seen it all over the course of the last few decades. And I am also a certified divorce financial analyst, which is its own subspecialty. And some of the things that I've learned in my studies and in the divorces we've worked on recently is what I want to share with you today. And then I've got my friend and colleague, Louise Larocque, with us today too. Louise is a friend. We've known each other for more than 25 years and worked together in a lot of different capacity. But Louise has been in the real estate world for 39 years, and then more than 30 years as a residential lender on the mortgage side. She is licensed in 50 states to talk in a fee-based way when it comes to your clients getting divorced, because she is a certified divorce lending professional. If you did not know that that's a certification that the mortgage world has, Louise has that. So she's going to speak to that expertise that she has here today. So what we want to talk about today is just this topic of divorce is very emotional, as all of you know who've dealt with it over the years, in a couple of different ways to look at divorce situations. So whether it's the client individually that you might be working with, if you're perhaps working with a couple in a mediation or collaboration perspective, and division of assets, how it looks from a financial planning perspective. I'm going to send that perspective to you today and give you some examples of things that you might not have thought about in your divorce cases before. The most important thing that I would love for everyone to take away is the importance of building a team for our shared clients. So we think that clients need 4 important people on their team. They're either their attorney or their mediator or combination of those two. A great accountant, and for many divorcing couples, somebody loses the CPA in the divorce and often has to find their own new person. A financial advisor who really understands divorce, and a mortgage officer, somebody who can really help the couple with the division of their family home or multiple properties, if that's the case. And when all 4 of us can come together in different capacities and share our areas of expertise, the outcome is the best for both parties. So that's what we want to talk about today, is things that you might not have thought about before, or realizing that maybe you're working in an area of specialty that belongs to someone else. So if you're the attorney who's giving, tax guidance, maybe it's time to loop in the CPA. Or if you're thinking about giving financial planning advice, it might be helpful to loop in the financial advisor earlier in the process. I cannot tell you how many times we get referred to a client who is post-divorce. Settlement is already done, the decisions have already been made, and there's no way we can influence that outcome because it's done. And so I try to ask our attorneys and accountants to please loop us in sooner, because there often are different analyses that we can do for you to help the client's case. And knowing that in advance before a settlement happens it can be really, really important for the client, sometimes for both of the clients. So we're going to talk about that today. And any questions that you have, please feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then Louise is going to jump in when we talk about property and mortgages and some different creative solutions that she has. And then we'll take questions for the last 10, 15 minutes or so. If there are any questions that you have, maybe pertaining to a case that you don't want to ask on a recorded webinar, by all means, feel free to reach out to us afterwards. And Anna can even put both of our emails in the chat so that if you wanted to reach out separately with anything that's confidential, we're happy to help you offline about that. So let's start with a couple of unusual things. Now, if this is your area of expertise, this might not be new for you, but these are about a half dozen or so situations that have come up in divorces that we've dealt with in the last year that were unusual. So I wanted to share some of them with you. The first is, and Louise and I were just talking about this, that this is a good forensic thing to look for. We had a situation with a divorcing couple. One of the people was working with our firm, and she was divorcing her husband. And she said, as we were looking through her list of assets, she said, some things seem to be missing. Like I thought we had other accounts, and I just can't seem to find them. Seemed a little suspicious. And what she ended up doing is we referred her to her mortgage closing document from 3 years prior. That was back when she and her husband were happy and willing to share all information with one another. And on that document, we were able to see the accounts that actually had gone missing. So if you're looking for accounts that may seem to have disappeared recently, that might be a good place to start, especially if it was back in a time when both spouses were willing to disclose all information and now are not. A second thing that came up that I thought was really, really fascinating, and we, when we do a deep dive with a client, and we can work with one of the divorcing people, or as a CDFA, I can actually work with both spouses and help both of them build separate and new financial plans. And when we looked at the list of assets they have, one of the things that came up in conversation is credit cards. And we're talking about who's keeping which credit card and dividing things up and starting fresh. But there were 1 million American Airlines points up for grabs. And they are transferable, but if one person got a new credit card, they would be walking away from the million airline points. So we were able to negotiate between the couple as part of the divorce, splitting the airline points between the two of them and working with the credit card companies to make that happen. That was pretty significant because that can be worth a lot in terms of vacations that somebody would have missed out on had we not brought that up in the negotiation. Another one is this. We tend to have clients who are very philanthropic. You probably do too. And we got referred to a client post-divorce. And when she came to us, we were going through her list of new assets and rebuilding her financial plan. And one of the things that I asked her about, knowing the couple, I said, and when your husband sold his business years ago, I know you're both pretty charitable. What about any philanthropy? What about a donor-advised fund? Because they had set up a donor-advised fund at the time of sale of the company. She forgot about it. She forgot, they settled, she walked away, and he ended up, because it was in his name originally, with a $550,000 donor advised fund. Now, it isn't a marital asset because once you grant money into the fund, it's the money of the funds and you're just the grantor. However, it would have been something we could have divided between the two of them, and then she could have had charitable giving set up for a long, long time, but she just forgot about it and settled. So please be sure when you're doing your fact finding, you're asking if there is a donor advised fund in existence, and then whose name is it in. Another one is, as you all know, if I come to the marriage with a pre-existing retirement account, that can be considered my asset, not necessarily a marital asset. But we just had a situation where someone had a pretty significant retirement account pre-marriage, but keep in mind that all contributions that do get made to that account in the marriage are counted as marital assets. So we had to go back in time and calculate all of the contributions and all of the growth over that particular time of their marriage, and then half of that was attributed to the divorcing spouse. So just keep in mind that even though you think you brought that account into the marriage and it's yours, anything that was contributed to it with marital assets is a marital asset. Here's another one that was quite a surprise, and we find this complication oftentimes in second marriages. So this was a very long-term pension. Husband had a 40 years with his company, very long-term pension, not that long-term of a marriage. They were married for 10 years. And so when she went to her attorney told her that she was eligible for 50% of the pension. And so they were moving forward with this calculation of 50% of a very significant amount of money. What ended up happening is his attorney understood that even though he had a 40-year pension, she was only eligible for 50% of the 10 years of marriage attributed to that pension. So way, way less than what her attorney was suggesting that she would be eligible for. She was not, because of the coverture fraction that had to be applied to, here's the asset, but how many years of marriage is applied to that asset? And so she ended up with significantly less. And so the whole negotiation had to get recreated because that dollar amount was so significantly different than what she had expected from her attorney's advice. Here's another one that we often see overlooked, HSA. How many people have an HSA? Our advice oftentimes for a couple who are married happily and planning for their future is to maximize the HSA and not spend it in any given year, but actually maximize it and save it for retirement and try to build that as an asset for additional retirement spending on your unreimbursed medical. The HSA, however, can be a pretty significant asset when you're divorcing, and oftentimes we find people forget about it. I just had a divorce with a $51,000 HSA that one of the spouses had forgotten about, and it came up in the final review of the assets, and it was, of course, something that was worth negotiating. It made more sense from a tax perspective for one spouse to keep all of it, because that was the spouse who was also continuing to manage the health insurance for the couple. But again, it's an asset that was part of the negotiation because 51,000 stayed on one side and it's very tax advantageous. So what does the other side get in exchange for that? And that was something that we had to have a conversation about. But an HSA, keep in mind that that's something that is divisible. This was one that was super interesting to me when we were accounting for all things of value. I had a client who said, and my spouse has been at his company for so long. Now, this is gray divorce. They were 65 and getting divorced. She said, after we divorce, at some point he's going to retire pretty soon. And she said, what about all that sick time and PTO? Because all of that sick time and PTO that he has, I know that they buy him out. And he gets a lump sum payout at retirement for that. It's got to amount to a bunch. And so we did the calculation and he had to disclose how much he had. And it was a $96,000 value that the second they were divorcing, he was going to be cashing out of. And so she was able to negotiate for half of the cost of that in the settlement. Again, these are the kinds of things that don't obviously show up on a balance sheet, but worth thinking about when someone's a long-term employee somewhere. And another one, you all probably know this if you do estate planning as well, but be careful and advise your clients or yourself when money gets inherited during the marriage. So often we see this where mom or dad passes away, leaves a significant amount of money to their kid, their adult child, as long as the person who is inheriting it keeps it separate from joint assets. So if I'm inheriting money from my parent, instead of putting it in a joint account with my spouse, I should leave it in an individual account only in my name so that it is segregated and separate from the marital asset. It just makes it easier later on, if in a divorce situation, to show where the inheritance came from, that it was never commingled with the marital assets, that it's maintained its own account in the one person's name, and it makes it easier to take that outside of the marriage in terms of divvying up the assets. It makes it easier. It's not saying it's perfectly clean, but it certainly makes it easier in the event of an ultimate divorce. And the last one is, this just happened recently with one of our clients. It was a relatively friendly divorce and it was being mediated. And in that process, the clients had been married for 9.5 years and they were ready to file. And we were able to negotiate postponing for 6 months. And in the postponement of 6 months, they reached the 10-year anniversary of their marriage, which meant that the spouse was eligible for 50% of the divorcing spouse's Social Security. And they didn't know that. They didn't understand that. And so when we looked at building 2 new financial plans and showing one spouse that without that 50% Social Security, your own Social Security is so much smaller. If you're both willing to wait and reach that 10-year mark, now 50% of your spouse's Social Security can come to you at retirement time because you've been married for 10 years. And to be really clear, it doesn't affect your ex-spouse, right? That was something that he was very concerned about. He'll get his full benefit. She'll get 50% of his benefit when it comes time to file, but only if you're at that 10-year anniversary. And because it was a relatively friendly divorce, they were both willing to wait because it really impacted both of their financial plans in a positive way. So something to consider, really looking at not just the assets, but important dates for turning 59 and a half and being able to access retirement accounts without penalty. Important date is 65 for Medicare or filing for Social Security. All of these different dates are important to keep in mind, including the 10-year marriage when it comes to dividing up certain assets and being eligible for certain benefits. So I'll pause for a moment and let me just check. I know we've got some questions coming in the chat, so let me just check here. Okay, a CPA question. So the question is, what obligation does a CPA firm have to a spouse regarding tax source documents of the other spouse used to file a joint tax return? So I'm gonna attempt an answer at this one because this is how we've done this with other CPA firms. If the CPA has done the joint return for the couple and the couple is divorcing, then the CPA, same as us, we're obligated to share that information with both spouses. But what we do first is we do a disclaimer and we email both spouses to say, we understand you're getting divorced. You're both going to need information from us. We're going to share that information, but we're going to share it equally with both of you. So anytime one spouse comes in and asks for something without the other spouse, we're going to CC the spouse. So all correspondence is very transparent. I do think that the CPA firm does have an obligation to share that information with the spouse if they were working with the couple on the taxes. But I can confirm that and get back to you on that, to David who asked the question. Okay, another question is, does the carve out of a retirement plan owned at the beginning of the marriage apply to other assets such as investment accounts, real estate, and other property? Let me just think. I want to make sure, Debbie, I understand your question. Would you mind unmuting just so I can ask you a question about that? Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, so you're saying if I have $100,000 401k prior to the marriage, are you saying, does that apply to other accounts such as investments, real estate, other property? Yeah, that there's an account, there's like an accounting for what each person is coming to the relationship with. And the key here is that if I have a separate account or you have a rental property and we're thinking about getting married, the key here is not to put everything in joint name. So the second you take your other property and put me on the title or put me on the mortgage, or I take my, my non-qualified investment account and add you on, now it's a marital asset. As long as you keep it in separate name from the beginning, then you can paper trail it and easily argue that that was mine, it's maintained by me, and it was never shared by you, and you never had access to it.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is tricky because this speaks to having a conversation with a couple prior to getting married and making sure that people really, really understand, all romance aside, this is yours, this is yours. Before we make it ours, let's just really understand the implications of it. And we're big proponents of prenups. And so having that conversation when people actually like each other is a heck of a lot easier than after the fact. But yes, those all count as premarital assets until you commingle them. The second you commingle them, it's game over. It's ours. Same is true for inheritance. If somebody has an inherited account that's in their own name, it maintains ownership by them, so that if there is a divorce, that inheritance pre-marriage is theirs. unless they put their spouse's name on it or their kids' names on it. As soon as it looks like it crossed the line into being a marital asset, game over, then it's up for grabs. Yeah, great, really great question though. Okay, keep the questions coming. What I want to just pivot to for a moment is uh, something that happened a couple of years ago. We got referred to a woman post-divorce. Her attorney is someone that is a friend of mine, and she said, "I'm sending you someone. She's wonderful. She's really sad. The divorce wasn't her idea. But she's settled, and I hope she has enough." And it was such a profound statement because hope she has enough. It's too late. She got sent to us when the settlement was done. And now the attorney was hoping that when we build her a financial plan, it works. Our philosophy is, and I know that this might be the opposite of how you've worked for your whole career, if you're an attorney or a mediator, but we really, really see a huge impact when the clients get referred to us at the beginning of the process. I, in fact, often say, if you're even contemplating getting divorced, please come sit with me before you call an attorney. Because when you sit down with an attorney, the questions that are going to come are significant questions. There are many of them. And oftentimes the client is so overwhelmed or emotional or heartbroken, they don't know how to answer the questions yet. And it opens a very, very long process for the client. If they can come meet with us beforehand, or whoever their financial advisor happens to be, what we're able to do is either sit down with the individual who's contemplating divorce or sit down with the couple. If they're willing to have a transparent conversation about it, we're able to build two new hypothetical financial plans. And we can look at pre-tax assets versus post-tax assets. We can look at a 401k versus a Roth. We can start to build income for them for the future. We can look at dividing up home equity, and we can start to build simultaneously two new hypothetical financial plans. Oftentimes we start with a 50-50 division just to have a baseline. And then we start negotiating back and forth for the different assets, just to see where could we have the most successful outcome on both sides, so that then when they sit down either with separate counsel or sit down for mediation, we've already looked at, well, what about my pension? I want to keep my pension, or please tell me I can afford to keep the house. The most important thing is to keep the kids in the marital home, right? There are all of these emotional decisions at play. But if we're able to have already gone in and say, look, you can't afford to keep the house unless this, and this happens, or you definitely can keep the pension because you're so emotionally tied to your pension, but you're going to have to give up this, and this in order for the plans to be equitable. Now, I understand this is a very ideal scenario. If we can get a couple to sit down with us and work on dividing up the assets, hypothetically speaking, and build these two new plans for them, but we've done it in the past couple of years where we've been able to work with both people to just show them. And again, this isn't a fee-based plan where we're just operating as neutral. We're not the financial advisor for either of them, but we can just be a neutral party, and we can build two new financial plans for them. Now they come to you, their attorney or separate attorneys, or they sit down in mediation and say, we've already talked about all of this, and we've already discussed this, and we already know I can keep the house if this happens. And now they're in a different place to be able to negotiate from, because we've run so many different scenarios in advance of that conversation with you. So to the extent that it's possible, we can do that. Most financial advisors who operate as CDFAs should be able to do that on a fee-only basis. But the other thing to keep in mind is when that is not probable and when one person is coming to you, what we're able to do is help the client who's getting divorced, help him or her with a new hypothetical plan, and we'll build a mock plan for their spouse. Even if their spouse has never met us, we don't know them at all, but we just know what the assets look like, we can build a plan for the client and a hypothetical plan for the divorcing spouse, so that they're able to go into their own attorney's meeting and say, I know I can give up this, and this, and my own plan still works. I'm willing to let all of these things go because I've run a plan for him or her, and I know it works on their side too. And we can kind of jump over a whole bunch of tension because the math makes sense when we're able to do that. And so, this whole process can be very emotional. Most of the time, people are not on the same page. It's not amicable. But if we're able to do some upfront work for you and do the tax analysis on the pre versus the post tax, do the analysis on, $1 million 401k is not the same as $1 million of home equity, but we see it all the time where people are just dividing everything in half. We can look at the tax bracket of each of the people post divorce and know, hey, one's in a super high tax bracket, one's in a very low tax bracket. Let's divide the assets up appropriately so that the person in the low tax bracket gets the higher tax things and pays at a lower tax rate, right? There are some very logistical ways to divide assets where both parties end up better off. But oftentimes they don't know that, or you as the attorney may not know this because you're not a financial advisor, totally understandably, but utilize our skills to be able to help your clients work through some of the math in advance. It could just save a lot of heartache, is that's the word I would use for it. And so I think, I'll pause for a second. I just see a couple of questions coming up here. Robert just said, we've advised to divide retirement assets in an effective way based on tax planning, tax brackets, Roth, pre-tax versus post-tax, only to have custodians not willing to divide it this way. Oh, interesting. Well, let's see. So there's the 401ks or the pensions, right, where the quadro could hopefully dictate a lot of this. But if they're not willing to divide it in a particular way, I'd push harder. So we have had this happen before where the initial response is no. And then with a letter from the attorney, with the divorce decree, with the quadro, like with all of the supporting documentation, we've been able to get exceptions for things. As long as it's legal, it should be able to be divided. But I haven't seen it where it's just a flat no. Now, if it's a flat no, despite all of your good work and logic, then it back to the drawing board to renegotiate for what is doable based on the tax outcome of each of the types of assets. But a really, really great question. I always say, when it comes to quadros or dividing assets, oftentimes with the custodian, they're just a basic customer service person and they might not have expertise in dividing assets per divorce. And so we just escalate it and often are able to get it approved. So it might just be worth kind of going up the chain of command to get to a person who could help you with it, because it is very specific. It's not a normal request. And so if you get to someone who could help you with that, you might be able to get a positive outcome for it. Okay, so when we think about not all assets are being created equal, and we're thinking about pensions and alternatives, one other thing I wanted to talk about too that often is a mystery in terms of divorce is annuities and life insurance. That there are these contracts that can be very, very complicated and really not clear if you just look at an annual statement. Sometimes it's really unclear to know what it is you're dealing with, that it's hard to quantify a value for it in terms of dividing up that asset. And for example, we had a case where couples divorcing, on one side there was a pension, and then in the marriage, they happened to have an annuity. And the annuity value, it was a decent value, but the pension was the real value in the marriage. And what we were able to do is really take a deep dive into that annuity contract to find out that even though the value of the annuity itself wasn't very significant, the payout rate was very significant. There were all kinds of guarantees and high watermarks over a very long period in this contract that when I say the value wasn't that great, the monthly payout when the client were to annuitize it actually matched the pension. And so it was being really undervalued for a lump sum. But when you look at the annuitization value of it, it was very, very significant for a lifetime. And so we were able to let one spouse keep the pension, the other spouse keep the annuitized annuity, and it really was equitable. But no one would have known that by looking at a statement. You really had to understand that how complex annuities are. Same with life insurance. Life insurance, whole life, universal life, adjustable life. These are all complicated products, and sometimes it's hard to know how to value it and how it's valuable for a client in a low versus a high tax bracket. Use us, right? Use your financial advisor expertise to do that work for you, we often get called on to just do an annuity analysis or a life insurance contract analysis to help a mediator or to help an attorney be able to negotiate it with their client. So just putting that out there, it's a complex thing. Speaking of complex things, so are mortgages. And so I'm going to just pivot to Louise, who has an expertise in helping clients who are divorcing when it comes to their existing mortgages, their existing properties. Gone are the days where you have to refinance or you have to sell a property to get the equity out equitably. And so I'm going to turn it over to my friend Louise, who's going to just talk about some specific examples of things your clients may be able to do that you might not be aware of. Louise, you have the
Thanks,
floor.
Amy. Appreciate it. So I have been working in the greater Springfield area for my career, but I am licensed for writing mortgages in 4 states. I'm able to write mortgages as a consultant in 50 states. And with the certified divorce lending professional, I am doing all 50 states as a consultant. So the first thing I wanted to mention is the difference between the buyout and the selling strategy. What most people don't realize is that when one spouse wants to stay in the property, due to usually it's the children that have to finish out whether it's going to be 12 years or finishing college and having that safe space to go. The buyout really involves so much more than a straight sale because you want to remember that you have a lot of fees that are going to be involved when you then sell. So you want to make sure that both parties understand the finances that are involved. Um, I'm supporting Amy's thoughts when meeting with the financial advisor prior because you want to formalize that end result. You definitely want to make sure that everybody's eyes are open with knowing the selling is cleaner. However, the buyout might be the right thing initially. We talked about whether or not an assumable mortgage would be better than refinancing together. And some of the things that came up when Amy and I were chatting was that oftentimes these days people don't realize, oh, I'll just assume the mortgage. Well, you have to qualify. So it means that you do need to be that person that goes in front of a mortgage originator and goes with full credit, full income. How did you separate divorce money? And if you didn't figure it out with the best uh, possible outcome monthly, your gross monthly income, you may not qualify to assume, even though that's your goal. The other thing about qualifying for assumptions is each mortgage product's a little different. So conventional lending is different from VA, FHA, and USDA, and many people don't even remember what kind of mortgage they have. So we do need to do that step to make sure that we analyze before they reach out to their mortgage servicer, how can we assume this mortgage? And then most assumable mortgages, you don't have the option to do a buyout, to do a cash out. So then you have a piece of real estate that that person's going to assume, and all of the equity has to be thought about for a future date. So there's a lot of pieces that feel right in the beginning and ultimately aren't the best source for people. One of the things that are very similar to that HSA account that Amy was referencing is when someone does an assumption or a refinance, they forget about the tax escrow and the homeowner's insurance escrows. And those are items that get netted out 3 to 4 weeks after a refinance might happen. So if you've thought about who's going to do the refinance, who's going to assume, someone may assume a mortgage and they've received quite a bit of an escrow that you didn't even think about. And if, these days with real estate taxes and home insurance, those amounts annually are pretty high. So we always analyze assumption may or may not be the right option. And the last thing about assumptions that people aren't realizing is that in 26 states, we have tenants by the entirety if you're married. And so automatically someone might assume, oh, I'm going to have the assumption of the mortgage and the other party is completely quitclaimed a warranty deed off the property. And it is going to go through that deeding process where if the other party goes off and tries to get financing, they won't be responsible under qualifying purposes to qualify with the old mortgage. However, as soon as the assumption is done and the tenants by the entirety is over, it automatically defaults in all 50 states to tenants by tenants in common with right of survivorship. And that can be really sticky in some bad circumstances. And they do, when we went through our training, some of the stories were mind-boggling because you say, gosh, in all of the years that I've been in business, I would never think that that could happen. And so that is something that you'd want to caution your client about. So we've also talked about co-ownership for a period of time. So again, you're meeting with people, you don't really know what their financial picture is going to be, what their goals are going to be. Do they want to stay in town? Do they want to try to co-parent? So for co-ownership, what could work is if both parties stay on the loan due to maybe a poor market for affordability, they're upside down with their mortgage balance. They have a really low interest rate and they just don't want to sell yet. And again, they're at that point where maybe one more year and that child is graduating high school, and that's when it's a little bit more comfortable to sell the property. So you could at that point say, let's stay as co-owner and let's budget what it would be for the one spouse to stay in the marital home and what's it going to cost for that second spouse to either purchase and have that monthly expense, and work that into your plan. And again, that would be something that we would decide, what's the market rent going to look like, or is that person going to take some of the assets from the division and purchase another home? And again, it all gets planned out, assuming that in a year to 2 years, then that home will get sold and the final amount will get dispersed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the mortgage and the rights of which products are available. The Fannie and Freddie mortgages that were available right before 2007 and 2008 were really pretty creative. And then in 2009, Fannie and Freddie just put a stop to everything that wasn't very black and white. Your ratios were very conservative and the underwriting was over the top. We're now seeing many more what we call non-QM mortgages reappearing. I'm doing one now where she is a psychotherapist. She's been a licensed W-2 employee for 5 years and decided in April of 2024 to go out on her own. We're able to do a bank statement loan that just sees all of her input from her deposits, 12 months, and we're able to average that, take a debt ratio of what her CPA gives us for her average monthly expenses, and we're able to actually give her a mortgage for a self-employed borrower who's not showing me a tax return based on just bank statements. So you have high debt to income ratio loans that are out there now. You'll have your bank statement loans. There's investment loans if they're needed. They call them DSCR. We also have FHA loans that will allow you to get a mortgage if your credit report score drops to as low as 500 with a decent down payment. So again, to think that someone's going to say, oh, I have poor credit, or I may have missed a couple of mortgage payments, or I may not have as much to put down. The products are out there, and sometimes it just matters. Let's talk about what we need to do to get you into the house. Let's figure out the strategy of maybe it's not going to work today, but we'll get you in 6 months or a year. And that's where my piece would be coming in, is to help you plan today. We're able to run some soft credits and look at, if I run it through a program, what do I need to do with my monthly debt to get my score where it needs to be for a loan approval? And so what we would do is we may say to the spouse, make sure you get this money from the divorce. Let's pay off this credit card or pay this money down. And now you're positioned to be able to finance.
And I think so this is a really important point, is getting the advisors involved earlier than later. So we were working on a divorce last year, and it was unclear whether one of the spouses was going to keep the house or not. And then it was also unclear if the divorcing spouse, who was an at-home parent with young kids, was going to be able to qualify for a new mortgage. Is he going to buy? Is he not going to buy? Would he rent for a little while? And so we just got Louise involved from the very beginning, and she was able to run a number of different scenarios to say, if you do it this way versus this way, and apply for all of it in advance of the divorce, so that everything was in place, so that if we're not getting divorced until, October, don't wait until October to call the mortgage person, because this is quite a process. And the way that the assets are divided in the divorce can really benefit both people, to make sure that they both end up with homes or both end up able to qualify for. I think another important thing to keep in mind here, and we've got lots of CPAs on the call, is the capital gain on the sale of the house. And remember, if it's been your home for 2 of the last 5 years and you sell it, as a married couple, you get a $500,000 gain that wouldn't be taxed. As a single person, it's $250,000. And so be mindful when you're thinking about selling the property. If there's a significant gain and you were going to sell sooner than later anyway, does it make sense to sell within that time frame, so you have access to the $500,000 gain, not the $250,000? So that can be a game changer for some people as well. So just keep that in mind. And I do want to make sure we save time for questions for folks. So you have the opportunity to either put your question in the chat and we'll answer it for you, or if you have a question that you want to interact with us, feel free to just put in the chat that you have a question. We can unmute you and ask it. Just a couple of other things to keep in mind that were unusual circumstances. We had, as many of you probably know, divorce rates for people age 40 and under are dropping significantly, now down to about 31%, attributed to the fact that young people are waiting longer to get married and waiting longer to have kids, or not even have kids. And so as a result of people just waiting a little bit longer, the divorce rate is significantly dropping. That's the good news. The bad news is divorce for people over 55. Gray divorce, silver divorce is rising quickly, higher than 50%. And so post-COVID, I'm sure you've seen this. We've had a number of clients who just, hunkered down for 18 months together and realized, yikes, this is what retirement's going to look like. Not that interested. And so older people are getting divorced. And I point this out because if you are 65 and getting divorced, it does not look like a 35-year-old's divorce. There's a lot at stake. We're talking about significant 529 college accounts. We're talking about pensions. We're talking about people too close to retirement to recreate their own lives in many cases. And so being very, very smart about how things get divvied up. 2 examples of this, gray divorce. One was that the divorcing, one of the spouses was not well, that was ill and did not have longevity on his side. So they knew they did not want to be together anymore. But if they divorced, she would be eligible for 50% of his Social Security. But if they didn't divorce when he died, she'd be eligible for 100%. And so they decided, when we looked at the hypothetical financial plans, like, go get your own house, let's just separate, and everyone thinks that they're divorced, but they're technically not divorced, because she'll have pension options and Social Security options, and he's not remarrying. So he said, look, I'm not trying to hurt you here. I just don't want to live with you. And so they're able to act divorced, but still be married, and financially it benefits both of them. The opposite is also true. We have a small handful of clients, and I'm sure you've had to deal with this situation with elder law planning, where someone has dementia, has some kind of cognitive issue, and will need nursing home care, assisted living, something where it actually, the couple is happy and wants to be together, but because of this circumstance, divorce is a possibility. And so how do you preserve some significant marital assets for the surviving spouse without the diagnosis if someone is going to be potentially Medicaid eligible, or at least able to do some significant elder law planning? So we have had some, we call them quiet divorces, where the family doesn't know that they're divorced, but they were able to legally divorce in order to protect some of the assets for the other spouse. So these are complex situations. I always say, to marry or not to marry, let's have the conversation about it, because romance aside, it often makes sense to do the math beforehand. And so we are good at math, and so are you. And so together, when we partner and build this team of a great financial advisor, a great mortgage officer, a great accountant, and a great attorney, together, I think that we can help our clients have better outcomes. So I will pause there. Any questions that anyone has, feel free to ask. You can put them in the chat, or feel free to just raise your hand and we can call on you. On the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should have a raise hand bar. Oh, no questions are jumping out. Louise, is there anything else you want to share that would be worth having our audience hear?
Well, as you just mentioned, with the older clientele that are divorcing, many people are not pro reverse mortgage, but reverse mortgages have come a long way in the last 20 years when they first were introduced. And I would say that it's definitely a product for the right person, maybe that family that doesn't have a whole lot of assets and they own their home. And, they had that mortgage burning party 20 years ago, which was very popular in New England anyway. So I wouldn't put a deaf ear on that product. It's a purchase or a refinance product. It's not only a refinance product. And as they age, they'll get more percentage of their equity to work with. It's a great safety net. I wanted to mention that.
Excellent. I think there's just such a bad reputation left over on reverse mortgages. And as
Yes.
you said, for the right circumstance, it can actually be quite beneficial and like provide incredible cash flow that did not exist. There's no other source for that kind of cash flow otherwise.
Correct.
Yeah, great. Yeah, Debbie just put in the chat that she said she would never have thought of adding a mortgage lender to the team. But this is, for a lot of couples, besides the retirement account, like this is the biggest asset. And we've seen it done poorly, and we've seen it done in a really, really creative way that both people benefit from it.
Well, and as we mentioned earlier when we were chatting about setting up that trust so that someone has the assets and the income that first month right after divorce, rather than waiting the 6 months for an alimony or a child support asset to show up. So again, it's just planning ahead.
Yep. All right, we've got a question. Let me make sure I understand this. Cam asked this question. How is the inherited asset when the beneficiary put it under his or her own name only instead of marital? Will the beneficiary continue to keep the asset? Okay, feel free to unmute. I'm going to try to answer this, but if you want to ask more questions, please do. So technically, Cam, when the benefit, so let's just say pre-marriage, I inherit $1 million and I keep it in my own name. It can also still have a beneficiary on it. So typically we see a TOD registration where a transfer on death is the structure. I'm the sole owner, but I can have it TOD to avoid probate, and I could name my spouse as the beneficiary. In the event of a divorce, it still should be segregated, still in my own name. It should not be included as a marital asset, and then I would change the beneficiary on the TOD post-divorce. So the original beneficiary, meaning like me in this example, would be able to keep the asset, and it would not be attributed to all of the marital assets nor divided up. Now, I say that, however, we've seen situations where we have that, and where the couple is saying, look, I'm trying to divide things up here, and you have the trust from your parents. Like, we all know you have the trust. Can we have a little flexibility here? So I'm not going to try and take the trust from your parents, but could you give me a little more of the home equity, because you've got a fallback plan that I don't have? And so we take it into account when we're building new financial plans for each of the people, but it is not necessarily an asset that would get divided in the divorce, that the asset itself. Do you want to
Thank
add?
you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And
Very comprehensive answers.
okay, good, great. Well, I'll tell you where this has come up interestingly. We had this happen in a divorce where the wife inherited money from her dad, and it was her dad's company stock, and it was so sentimental to her. But she inherited it and just put it into the joint account. And when it came time for divorce, she said, look, I know this sounds ridiculous. She said, just to me, but she said, is there any way you can make sure I keep my dad's stock? Well, of course, right? And her husband, her soon-to-be ex-husband, knew that that was very sentimental to her. So we were able to negotiate, like, you keep the Apple and the Tesla. She really wants dad's stock. Then we had to look at cost basis, and we had to look at the tax impact of each and analyze it. But in the end, in her own brokerage account, she kept her dad's stock, even though it was a marital asset, because she had put it in joint name. But sometimes we'll come across things that was like, that was my grandmother's stock, or I don't want to sell that, or no way can I sell the family vacation home. How do we work around it to make sure that that doesn't have to get sold in the divorce? So we really want to understand upfront the sentimental assets, and then is there a way for us to quantify and build into these two new financial plans a workaround so that someone doesn't have to necessarily give up the thing that they're so sentimental about. I will tell you on the flip side of it, it's also great to know if you're only representing one of the people, what the sentimental assets are, because now you know where your negotiation power is. And so we had this situation, I don't know what it is that keeps coming up with middle-aged men and their pensions, but they're so, we just have seen it so many times, so possessive about like, I'm not giving up my pension. And so when we know that that's the case, we're going to ask for it. And we're going to ask for it over and over and over until we get to a point where, obviously with the help of a lawyer, we get to a point where we can say, okay, so let's say no thanks to the pension, but here is all the math that will show if I don't take the pension, these are all of the other things I need to make the plan work for me. And so we save that emotional card until round 3 or 4, and then say, okay, I would be willing to let you keep your pension, but here's what I want in exchange for it. And it usually works out in the favor of the person because people make bad math choices when they are emotional. And so knowing that is very helpful in the negotiation. So if you have a situation like this where you're saying, oh, I really want to fight for my client for this thing, and I'm not sure what's the equivalent thing we could give up, that's where we come in and we can help you with that. Oftentimes we need the accountant's help too, which is again the case for building the team, because we all have our area of expertise that we can use to weigh in on and help the client make a great decision. Okay, one last check to see if anybody has any other additional questions before we adjourn. All right, so just last thing I would say before we stop the recording is if you have a question, like I said in the very beginning, and it's too personal or it's related to a case that you don't want to answer or ask on this recorded line, by all means, if you scroll up in the chat, my email and Louise's is in there. Feel free to reach out to us directly, and we're happy to help you on a case-by-case basis as well. Thanks so much for being here. This is a tough subject, and just thank you for the work that you all collectively do to help your clients. It really does make a difference when we can help them get through a pretty tough situation and feel like they can start fresh on the other side. Louise, thank you so much for your expertise and for being here. Keep in mind, Louise and I can both work in all 50 states. So if you've got cases in other areas, we're happy to help consult on any of those for you. Thanks everybody for being here. We'll see you hopefully in 2 weeks. We've got another series of webinars coming over the course of the summer. So thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you.